Welcome to Open BXRX Tuesday on BronxNet. I'm your host, Karen Aline, and I'd like to invite you to get social with us at BronxNet TV on Instagram and Twitter, and BronxNet Community Television on Facebook. The 2021 school year was a year for learning how to adjust to a new normal. Now, as we get ready to begin the 2022-2023 academic year, parents, staff, and students are left wondering what new normal they may have to learn. Joining me now to give us an overview for the COVID guidelines of the new school year is Chalkbeat reporter Rima Amin. Rima, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Now, before we talk about the new school year, can you actually just let us know what were some of the previous prevention measures New York City schools took upon the first return to in-person learning?
Yes. So initially, after COVID, when schools first reopened, there were many mitigations. Children were required to social distance. At first, it was 6 feet, if we all remember that, and then later it reduced to 3 feet. Masks were mandated for everybody in the building, and then there was also randomized in-school PCR testing. Which is just the sort of the most sensitive COVID testing that you can do, just for a share of students and staff within the building. And you have to remember too that at the time, by the end of that school year, I think it was about 40%, definitely less than half of the city's public school students had actually opted to even be in the building. They were doing hybrid learning, so kids would go in, one, two, three times a week, depending on the school. And less than half of the city students actually opted for that. So with all of these measures in place, you also had far less people actually inside of the buildings.
Now, as I mentioned, it's a new school year, and our response to COVID is much different from how it was even a year ago. Now, what are some of the guidelines or an overview of some of the guidelines that we have for this year, and how is it so different from last year?
Yeah, so all of the measures that I just mentioned, many of those are going to be gone for the school year that's to start on September 8th. So this school year, there will be no in-school PCR testing. Instead, at-home tests will be sent home with kids and staff, as well as more tests will be sent home with students and staff who have potentially been exposed to someone with COVID inside of the school. Masks are no longer mandated. That was also the case in the spring of the last school year. The mayor had lifted that mandate in March, I believe, for most students. And students and staff are going to be asked to stay home when they're sick or when they test positive for COVID, which is the same as has been since schools reopened. But they can actually return to the building after 5 days from their positive test, as long as their symptoms are improving.
Now, you mentioned that COVID testing is kind of going to be a lot different from how it was last year. Now, I know testing was like a huge priority for the city last year and a little bit this year. How do you think that's going to just affect students now that they no longer have to worry about testing in regards to school?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because the in-school PCR testing that was previously happening inside of schools was really only happening with a small share of students. At one point, it was just 20% of I believe it was unvaccinated students, and that had to be students who like consented to testing. So if you think about it, that's like a really small percentage of the kids that actually go in the building. And so experts had told us that that actually probably wasn't the most like effective use of in-school testing. When you think about the cost of it. So my sense is that it's likely not to dramatically impact students and staff and how they're thinking about COVID. But the difference here is that people I think generally have gotten used to at-home COVID tests. I know that I have a stash in my house, and I'm sure many people watching this have taken at least one. And those will be provided to students and staff. So this was the case at the end of the last school year too. So I think it'll be interesting to see just if that supply is enough. The course of the virus has been very volatile, as we've seen over these past 2 years. So when cases are rising again in the city, as we know they're dropping right now, but if they start going back up, how is that going to impact how many at-home tests kids need and all of that? So I think that's something that's to be seen.
Now, you may have touched on it, but can you explain how are they planning to address a positive COVID case in the event that it does actually happen? Now that kids are going to be, in school together without masks, how are they going to address that?
Yes. So the Department of Education is strongly urging families of students and staff who test positive for COVID are supposed to stay home. Even if they start displaying symptoms, they are asked to stay home and not show up to school. If you do test positive for COVID, what the DOE has said is that you must isolate or stay home for 5 days. If your symptoms begin to improve after those 5 days, you can return to school, but you must stay masked inside of the building from that day of return until through day 10 of either. So that means 10 days after you've tested positive or 10 days after you started showing symptoms. Sometimes we will show symptoms of COVID and test positive later. Um, and it's important to remember, though, that there is no requirement to show proof of a negative test. It's such a large school system. So what happens on the ground at certain schools, sometimes, we don't know. Maybe there's a school out there that's like requiring kids to show a proof of negative test. But in general, that is not required under these new DOE guidelines. So it's a bit of an honor system.
Now, the use of masks have been very controversial in school settings for a very long time. And you mentioned that children, and I think the teachers as well, are going to be, they're not going to be required to wear them in school. Do you think that, this could be possibly a better outcome? Or do you think that, we should still kind of use masks because they're in such close proximity to one another?
What I can say is that the CDC, the CDC had recently released its COVID, recommendations for school settings, and in those guidelines, they have recommended that masks should be worn in schools that are in communities with a high COVID transmission rate. I'm actually not 100% sure if the transmission rate is still high in New York City, but I know it was, just a couple weeks ago when the city announced how it would handle COVID mitigation for this school year. And so, that's the recommendation of the CDC. And the DOE has also sort of, in their guidelines, you'll see that they sort of strongly encourage students and staff to wear masks. So I think still, though, it's a very personal choice. As you said, it's been a very charged conversation. Um, the other thing I'll say is that when the city dropped the mask mandate in the spring, Chalkbeat, my colleagues and I went and talked to students, all over the city to see, like, how do you feel about this? This is something you've been doing for more than a year now, almost 2 years. And it was actually striking to hear how many students said that they would continue keeping their masks on. And then we also talked to students who were like, sort of, hallelujah, we don't we don't have to wear these anymore. So I just think the response is certainly going to be mixed, and I don't think it's going to be surprising, though, if you do see a large portion of kids in certain communities or schools that have been heavily impacted by COVID to keep wearing masks.
Now, I really like to know what is the update on vaccines, especially because we may have a lot of new kids who are entering school for the first time. What's the update on that?
Yes, so there is no vaccine mandate for students for New York City public schools. Staff is still required to be fully vaccinated against COVID. This was also the case last year, even under the previous administration, under former Mayor Bill de Blasio. And also, vaccines are required for any visitors to school buildings, but again, they are not required for students. However, if you are a student that is participating in what they call a high risk extracurricular activity, so think like sports, potentially like, dance, those students are required to be fully vaccinated. And the mayor had sort of indicated that this was many months ago. He had said that he would be interested in a COVID vaccine mandate for students. As we know, students are required to get a list of, or be vaccinated against a list of diseases and illnesses before they even enroll in public school, and throughout grade school. But it seems though that the mayor, sort of quietly moved off of that position. If you remember, he lifted the vaccine mandate for out of town athletes and performers, and then peeled back other COVID mitigations such as the mask mandate. Even though while his administration is still strongly encouraging people to wear masks, so doesn't seem like that's on the horizon or that's coming anytime soon. So I guess we'll see if there's a change to that.
So, where can parents go to learn more about COVID safety measures taking place in New York City schools? Because, as we know from last year, things constantly change all the time.
Yes. Well, I would definitely encourage anyone to keep up with our news website at chalkbeat.org/NY, like New York. But also, of course, the Education Department has a list of its new guidelines on its website. If you just go to, the New York City Department of Education main website, you can find the COVID guidelines there.
All right. Now I have one more question. I want to know what is your overall, or what have you heard from, a lot of students and families in regards to the new upcoming school year?
Um, you know, I think that last year there was a lot of nervousness, and a lot of excitement among families. It was really a mixed bag. Some kids were going back to school full time for the first time since March 2020, and I think there's not a ton of that same feeling this year. Last year was nothing close to normal, especially with the Omicron variant, and there were a lot of kids who missed a lot of days of school, as well as staff because they had COVID and there was a lot of disruption. But we're just not hearing that same level of nervousness, and I think that there are though families. The city has proposed budget cuts for schools across the city, so I think a lot of people are sort of focused on that and how it's going to affect classrooms and class sizes and the things that their schools are going to be able to offer. And I should say there are also families that are still concerned about the city peeling back some of these COVID mitigations. So the long answer to your question is it's still
It's
all over the
okay. Well,
place.
at least we know what they're thinking, and this, we have this to let them know what to expect for the new school year. Everything, and also thank you so much for joining me, to talk about this.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
We'll be right back with more Open BXRX Tuesday.